You spend 41 years building roads, bridges, and other people's futures. Then one phone call tells you your own life no longer belongs to you. My daughter-in-law didn't ask if her brother could move into the home I spent a lifetime earning. She informed me that he was coming, that my son had already agreed, and if I didn't like it, I could sell my farm and disappear into a retirement home, where, according to her, I belonged. She had no idea that those words would destroy her family instead of mine. Please, before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are listening from today. My name is Walter. For 41 years, I worked as a civil engineer, the kind of man who arrived at construction sites before sunrise and often left long after everyone else had gone home. My career wasn't glamorous. It was thousands of mornings reviewing blueprints under fluorescent lights, inspecting drainage systems in freezing rain, approving concrete pours before the trucks arrived, and solving problems most people would never notice unless something failed. Every bridge that stood, every road that survived another winter, every neighborhood that stayed dry after heavy storms reminded me why details mattered. I believed that doing the right thing wasn't about applause. It was about sleeping peacefully at night because you knew your work could withstand pressure. Vacations were rare. Promotions came slowly. Money accumulated one careful paycheck at a time. My wife, Carol, used to joke that I trusted a tape measure more than I trusted people, and she wasn't entirely wrong. She understood the sacrifices because she made them with me. While I was solving engineering problems across Tennessee, she quietly held our family together. She raised our son Nathan into an honest, dependable man, while never complaining about the evenings I missed or the weekends stolen by emergency projects. When Carol passed away after her battle with cancer, the silence inside our house became heavier than any structure I had ever designed. I finished working because routine was the only thing keeping grief organized. But retirement slowly stopped looking like an ending and started looking like the first chance I'd ever had to breathe. For more than a decade, I had driven past the same forgotten property tucked into the foothills of East Tennessee. 22 acres surrounded by rolling hills, an aging farmhouse abandoned since the 1940s, a weathered barn collapsing under decades of neglect, and a creek running across limestone shelves with water so clear it reflected the morning sky like polished glass. Most people saw an expensive demolition project. I saw peace. I saw the life Carol and I had dreamed about but never reached together. At 65 years old, I finally bought that land for $187,000. Every dollar came from decades of overtime, delayed vacations, careful investments, and refusing shortcuts. Standing alone in that overgrown field, I promised myself something I had never promised before. No deadlines, no office politics, no emergency phone calls before sunrise. Just honest work, quiet mornings, and a place where every improvement would belong to me instead of another client. I had absolutely no idea that before I could enjoy even a full year of that peace, someone inside my own family would decide they were entitled to everything I had spent an entire lifetime building. The first year on the farm was nothing like the peaceful retirement brochures promised, and I loved every exhausting minute of it. Every morning began before daylight with a mug of black coffee in one hand and a notebook full of measurements in the other. The old farmhouse had good bones, but time had been merciless. The front porch leaned several inches to the left, where one of the support posts had rotted away. Half the barn roof had collapsed under years of heavy snow and neglect. Blackberry vines swallowed entire fence lines, and the kitchen floor was so soft in places that each step felt like walking across wet cardboard. Most people would have hired a contractor and written checks until everything looked new again. I couldn't do that. After spending 4 decades building things with my own hands and my own judgment, I wanted this place to carry my fingerprints. I hired 2 local brothers, Cody and Dale, to help with the heavy lifting, but every decision, every measurement, every beam that stayed or disappeared passed through me first. We tore out rotten flooring, reinforced the foundation, replaced damaged support piers, rebuilt the porch from the frame up, and restored the original stone fireplace instead of covering it with modern materials. I wired the workshop myself, installed new plumbing where it was needed, poured fresh concrete footings for a covered back porch, and spent countless evenings sanding old oak floors until they glowed with the warm color they had hidden for decades beneath dirt and neglect. My back reminded me almost daily that I was 65 instead of 35, but pain never bothered me as much as unfinished work. Whenever storms rolled across the valley, I simply adjusted the schedule. Rainy days became opportunities to waterproof the basement, organize tools, or study the next phase, while thunder echoed through the hills. Slowly, almost without realizing it, the abandoned property stopped looking forgotten and started feeling alive again. Nathan visited whenever work allowed. He drove down from Charlotte several weekends that first year, arriving tired after long hours at his engineering consulting firm, but always ready to help. Together we hung drywall in the master bedroom, rebuilt sections of fencing along the creek, and spent one entire Saturday laying stone around the garden beds using sketches Carol had drawn years before in a small notebook she kept beside our kitchen window. She had never seen this farm, but somehow her ideas still found their way into it. More than once, Nathan and I stopped working just to imagine what she would have said about the view from the back porch as the evening sun settled behind the ridge. Those quiet conversations meant more to me than either of us admitted. 2 years and nearly $94,000 later, the farmhouse finally became the home I had imagined during all those years of driving past it. 3 comfortable bedrooms, 2 updated bathrooms, wide plank oak floors glowing beneath natural light, a kitchen built for real cooking instead of convenience, and a broad covered porch overlooking fields where deer stepped cautiously from the tree line almost every evening. I planted tomatoes, beans, peppers, and herbs in the garden, kept 6 chickens that rewarded my patience with fresh eggs every morning, learned to bake bread that gradually became edible, and spent peaceful evenings reading books I had postponed for decades, because work always came first. For the first time since Carol died, the silence around me no longer felt empty. It felt earned. I honestly believed I had finally reached the chapter of life where hard days existed only in memory. I couldn't have been more wrong. 14 months after I moved into the finished farmhouse, I finally believed life had settled into the rhythm I had spent decades chasing. Every morning started with coffee on the back porch, while mist drifted across the creek and the first sunlight climbed over the ridge. The chickens wandered through the yard as if they owned the place. Deer crossed the far edge of the field almost every evening, never in a hurry, never afraid. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything I had spent 41 years working toward. That peace ended the moment my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw Cassie's name. Before I even answered, something inside me tightened. She had a habit of beginning every conversation as though a decision had already been made, and everyone else simply needed to cooperate. "Walter," she said without wasting a single second on small talk, "we've come up with the best solution for everyone." I leaned back in my chair and watched a hawk circling above the tree line. "What solution is that?" I asked. She explained that her brother Kevin and his wife Sherry had lost their rental after the owner sold the building. They had been staying with her and Nathan for several weeks, and according to her, the apartment had become too crowded. She described how stressful everything had been, how Kevin was trying to get back on his feet, how Sherry was having trouble finding work, and how family was supposed to help each other during difficult times. I listened without interrupting because experience had taught me that people usually revealed much more when they believed no one was challenging them. Then she delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Kevin and Sherry will be moving into your farmhouse by the end of the month. Nathan already agrees, so I wanted to let you know before they start packing." There was no question, no pause, no respect for the fact that she was talking about my home. She wasn't asking permission. She was announcing a decision she believed had already been settled. I stayed quiet for several seconds, hoping she might realize what she had just said. Instead, she continued explaining which bedroom they would probably use and how they could help around the property while they stayed there for a few months. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. "Cassie, when exactly did I agree to any of this?" She hesitated for the first time. "Well, we're discussing it now." "No," I answered calmly. "You're informing me after you've already made plans." She sighed with obvious frustration. "Walter, you have 3 bedrooms and you're living out there alone on 22 acres. Kevin and Sherry aren't irresponsible people. They'll help maintain the place, and honestly, it might even be good for you to have company." I looked across the field where the wind bent the tall grass in slow waves. That house was an extra space waiting to be filled. Every room carried memories, every board had been repaired by my own hands, and every quiet morning reminded me why I had chosen this life. "This isn't a guest house," I said evenly. "It's my home." Her tone immediately hardened. "Nathan believes this is the right thing to do. Family takes care of family." I noticed she still hadn't said Nathan actually wanted this. She kept hiding behind broad statements instead of his own words. Then came the sentence I would never forget. If you can't support your family, maybe this farm isn't the right place for you anymore. There are some very nice retirement communities nearby. We've even looked at a few. For just a moment, I closed my eyes. 41 years of work, every overtime shift, every missed holiday, every dollar saved instead of spent. She had reduced all of it to an inconvenience, standing in the way of what she wanted. Anger would have been easy. Raising my voice would have been satisfying. But engineering had taught me something valuable decades earlier. Emotion solves nothing. Preparation solves everything. I ended the call politely, wished her a good afternoon, and set my phone on the kitchen table. Then I pulled out a yellow legal pad, picked up the same mechanical pencil I had carried through most of my career, and began writing a list. At the top of the page, I wrote 4 simple words: protect what you've earned. The next morning, I was awake before sunrise. Not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already moved past the argument and into planning. Fear has a way of making people react. Experience teaches you to prepare instead. By 7:30, I was driving toward Calhoun with a folder tucked neatly on the passenger seat containing property records, insurance documents, and every text message Cassie had sent over the previous several weeks. During my career, I had learned that facts carried far more weight than emotions, especially when families convinced themselves that feelings could replace legal boundaries. Gerald Poole welcomed me into his office with the same quiet professionalism he had shown when I bought the farm. After exchanging a few pleasantries, I explained everything exactly as it had happened, never exaggerating, never adding opinions. I told him Cassie had announced that Kevin and Sherry would be moving into my home, claimed Nathan had already agreed, and suggested I sell my property and move into assisted living if I refused. Gerald listened carefully, occasionally making notes without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands across his desk and looked directly at me. "Walter," he said, "this is actually much simpler than you think. Your name is the only one on the deed. No one, not your son, not your daughter-in-law, not any other family member has legal authority to invite people to occupy your property without your permission." Hearing those words didn't surprise me, but it settled something inside me. Gerald explained that if Kevin and Sherry arrived after being told they were not welcome, they would simply be trespassing under Tennessee law. He advised me to document every conversation, preserve every text message, and avoid emotional confrontations. If they refused to leave, he continued, you call the sheriff. Don't argue. Don't negotiate. Let the law do its job. I thanked him, shook his hand, and left feeling calmer than I had since Cassie's phone call. My second stop that morning was my insurance agent's office. Some people would have considered that unnecessary, but construction had taught me that risk rarely announces itself before it arrives. I explained the situation, asking whether unauthorized occupants could affect my homeowner's policy or create liability issues. He reviewed my file before nodding slowly. "You're right to ask," he said. "If people move in without a formal agreement, especially if they refuse to leave later, it can complicate claims and expose you to unnecessary legal problems." He updated my records and encouraged me to notify him immediately if anyone attempted to establish residency without my consent. As I walked back to my truck, another thought occurred to me. Evidence. Opinions disappear. Memories fade. Video doesn't. That afternoon, I drove to a hardware store in Athens and purchased 2 high-quality cellular trail cameras, the same type we had occasionally used to monitor expensive equipment on remote construction sites years earlier. I spent the rest of the day installing one near the entrance to the gravel driveway, where every vehicle would be recorded before reaching the house, and another beneath the barn overlooking the front porch and parking area. I tested both systems repeatedly until motion alerts appeared instantly on my phone. Every angle was carefully adjusted to eliminate blind spots. Every recording would be automatically backed up with a precise timestamp. Standing beside the old cedar tree where I had hidden the first camera, I realized something important. I wasn't preparing for strangers. I was preparing for people who believed sharing my last name somehow gave them ownership of my life's work. That realization hurt far more than I expected. Later that week, I drove north to meet Patricia Marsh, an attorney whose practice focused on family and property law. Unlike Gerald, who specialized in real estate transactions, Patricia dealt with conflicts after relationships had already begun falling apart. She listened without interrupting while I explained everything from the beginning. When I finished, she leaned forward and spoke with complete certainty. Walter, save every text, every voicemail, every email, and every photograph. If anyone steps onto your property after you've clearly told them they don't have permission, you call me first, then law enforcement. Stay calm, say exactly what needs to be said once, and let your documentation speak for you. I hired her before leaving her office, not because I expected a courtroom battle, but because I had learned long ago that hoping for the best never meant ignoring the worst. Driving home through the Tennessee hills that evening, I looked across the valley glowing beneath the setting sun and realized the farm had already become more than land. It had become a test of whether I was willing to defend everything I had spent a lifetime earning, even if the people forcing that fight shared my own family. No. That weekend, Nathan called. His voice carried the careful hesitation of someone trying to keep two worlds from colliding. Before he even spoke, I knew the conversation wasn't really his. It sounded rehearsed, as though every sentence had been practiced somewhere else before reaching me. "Dad," he began, "I've been thinking about Kevin and Sherry." I rested against the porch railing and looked across the pasture where the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. "Have you?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. "Cassie's under a lot of pressure. They've had a rough year. Maybe they could stay with you for just a couple of months until things settle down." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked the question Cassie had carefully avoided. "Nathan, did you agree to this before your wife called me?" Silence filled the line. It lasted only a few seconds, but it told me more than any explanation could. Finally, he admitted, "She mentioned it before she called you." "That's not what I asked," I replied calmly. Another pause followed. "No," he said at last. I didn't actually agree. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. Not because Nathan had lied, but because I could hear how exhausted he sounded, trying to keep everyone else happy. He had become a man constantly negotiating peace, without realizing he was always the one paying for it. I invited him to the farm the following weekend, asking him to come alone. "There's something I want to show you," I said. "Not today. In person." He agreed, without asking questions. When Nathan arrived Saturday morning, I noticed the change immediately. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of responsibilities that didn't belong entirely to him. The easy smile he used to wear had become forced, appearing only out of habit before disappearing almost as quickly. We spent the morning repairing part of the fence along the creek, splitting firewood, and talking about ordinary things like weather, work, and football. Only after lunch did we sit on the back porch overlooking the valley where the conversation finally turned serious. "Dad," Nathan said carefully, "why are you making this such a big issue? It's only supposed to be temporary." I looked toward the barn before answering. "Because temporary has a habit of becoming permanent when people stop respecting boundaries." He frowned, but stayed quiet, so I continued. 6 weeks ago, Kevin and Sherry moved into your apartment for what was supposed to be a few days. Now they're still there. Today they're asking for my house. What happens when 3 months become 6? What happens when 6 months become 2 years? What happens when they decide leaving isn't convenient anymore? Nathan rubbed the back of his neck without responding. I could almost see the questions forming in his mind. "Dad, they're family." "No," I answered gently. "They're your wife's family. That doesn't automatically make them my responsibility." He lowered his eyes. "Cassie says they just need one opportunity." "Then why does that opportunity have to cost someone else?" I asked. The porch fell silent again. Neither of us enjoyed where the conversation was leading, but avoiding uncomfortable truths had never solved a single engineering problem in my entire career. It wouldn't solve this one either. Before Nathan drove home the next afternoon, I made one final decision. There were simply too many unanswered questions. Kevin and Sherry's financial struggles, Cassie's confidence that my property would soon become available, and Nathan's obvious uncertainty didn't fit together. I needed facts instead of assumptions. The following Monday, I contacted a private investigator Patricia Marsh had recommended. His name was Dennis Whitfield, a former investigator with more than 20 years of experience tracking financial records, property disputes, and civil cases. His voice was calm, direct, and refreshingly free of drama. I gave him 3 names: Kevin, Sherry, and, after a brief moment of hesitation, Cassie. "I want the truth," I told him. "Nothing more and nothing less." Dennis explained exactly what he could legally obtain through public records, court filings, financial history, and civil databases. The fee was $450. Compared to the value of everything I had worked for, it felt insignificant. 5 days later, an email arrived just before sunset. I carried my laptop onto the back porch, poured myself a small glass of bourbon, and opened the report expecting to confirm little more than financial hardship. Instead, every page revealed something darker. Kevin's renovation business had collapsed years earlier, leaving behind a $23,000 court judgment that remained unpaid. His credit score had fallen into the low 500s. 2 vehicles were still under heavy loan balances. Sherry's bankruptcy filing remained active on her record, and the job Cassie claimed she had recently lost had actually ended well over a year earlier. They hadn't simply fallen on hard times. They had been surviving by moving from one relative's home to another, leaving instability behind them wherever they went. As troubling as those discoveries were, Dennis ended his report with a short note that immediately caught my attention. Additional financial activity involving Nathan and Cassie may warrant further investigation. I read that sentence twice. Something inside me said the real story had only begun. I called Dennis Whitfield the moment I finished reading the report. "I want you to keep digging," I said. "Something doesn't add up." He didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Professionals rarely do. If there's more to find," he replied, "I'll find it." 3 days later, another email appeared in my inbox just after lunch. I carried my laptop to the kitchen table, opened the file, and immediately realized this report was different. The first page wasn't about Kevin or Sherry. It was about Nathan and Cassie. My stomach tightened before I even reached the second paragraph. According to Dennis's investigation, over the previous 10 months, approximately $38,000 had been transferred from accounts belonging to Nathan and Cassie into accounts controlled by Kevin. Each payment was labeled as a loan or temporary financial assistance, but there were no repayment records, no written agreements, and no evidence that any legitimate business investment existed. I leaned back in my chair and stared through the kitchen window toward the field. $38,000. Nathan had once proudly told me he and Cassie were saving for the down payment on their first home. He had worked overtime, accepted weekend consulting projects, and skipped vacations because owning a house mattered to him. I remembered the excitement in his voice 18 months earlier when he showed me photographs of neighborhoods outside Charlotte where they hoped to settle. Now, that dream had quietly disappeared, and he had no idea why. I kept reading. The next discovery hit even harder. Cassie hadn't recently left her marketing position as she had claimed. She had resigned 9 months earlier and never told Nathan the truth. Instead, she allowed him to believe their household still had 2 steady incomes while she continued withdrawing money from their joint savings account. Dennis estimated that if spending continued at the same pace, the account would be nearly empty within a few more months. I rubbed my forehead, trying to understand how one deception had become so many. But the report wasn't finished. Dennis had uncovered documentation showing Cassie had submitted an application for financing using Nathan's employment and income information without fully informing him. The application had ultimately been denied, but the records clearly showed she had acted alone. Whether she believed she was protecting her brother or simply convincing herself everything would somehow work out no longer mattered. She had crossed a line that honest people don't cross. Then I reached the final section of the report, and everything suddenly made sense. Dennis had located billing records indicating Cassie had consulted a property attorney in Nashville. The subject of that consultation wasn't Kevin's housing problem or family financial planning. It concerned whether a relative could potentially establish a partial ownership interest in real estate through financial contributions or extended occupancy. I read those words again, slower this time. She wasn't simply trying to help Kevin and Sherry find a temporary place to stay. She had explored the possibility of creating a future legal argument involving my farm. Even if such a claim had little chance of succeeding under Tennessee law, forcing a legal dispute could still cost months of stress, thousands of dollars, and endless complications. Suddenly, her confidence during that phone call made perfect sense. She hadn't been improvising. She believed she had already found a strategy. I closed the laptop and sat in complete silence. Outside, the creek continued flowing exactly as it had the day before. The chickens wandered across the yard without understanding that anything had changed. Nature remained honest. People, unfortunately, did not. I wasn't furious. Anger clouds judgment, and I needed mine sharper than ever. What I felt instead was disappointment so deep, it almost became sadness. I had welcomed Cassie into our family years earlier because she made Nathan happy. I had trusted that she cared about him as much as he cared about her. Now, I was looking at evidence suggesting she had slowly sacrificed their future to rescue people who refused to take responsibility for their own lives. That evening, I called Patricia Marsh and summarized every finding. She listened carefully before speaking. "Walter, you absolutely did the right thing by investigating this before anyone moved onto your property. Here's what we're going to do next." She instructed me to send certified letters, formally notifying Cassie that no person had permission to occupy my property without my written consent, and that any future attempt to claim an ownership interest would be immediately challenged. Every communication would be documented. Every response would be preserved. Every step would remain inside the law. After hanging up, I prepared the paperwork exactly as she instructed. As I sealed the final envelope, one thought refused to leave my mind. The real confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was coming, and this time I would be completely ready. The certified letters went out on Monday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, I was repairing one of the fence posts near the lower pasture when my phone vibrated in my pocket. The motion alert from the trail camera appeared on the screen with a live image attached. A dark blue pickup truck with North Carolina plates had just turned onto my gravel driveway. I didn't panic. I didn't rush. I simply brushed the dirt from my gloves, picked up my coffee from the porch railing, and watched the truck continue its slow climb toward the farmhouse. Everything I had prepared for was finally happening. The truck stopped beside the garden, exactly where the camera covered every angle. The driver's door opened first. Kevin climbed out wearing a faded Braves cap, stretching his back after the long drive while scanning the property with the unmistakable expression of someone already imagining how he might use it. Sherry stepped out a moment later, folded her arms, and slowly looked from the barn to the porch before letting out a small sigh that sounded more judgmental than impressed. Neither of them looked surprised to be there. They looked expected. That told me Cassie had convinced them the decision had already been made. I walked down the porch steps before either of them could approach the front door. "Afternoon," I said evenly. "I wasn't expecting visitors today." Kevin forced an easy smile and extended his hand. "Walter, good to finally see you again." Cassie said everything was settled. "We figured we'd get unloaded before dark." He nodded toward the pickup bed where several suitcases, storage bins, and household boxes were stacked beneath a tarp. They hadn't come for a visit. They had packed their lives. "I'm afraid you've been given incorrect information," I replied. "No one has permission to move into this property." Kevin's smile faded slightly, though he tried to recover it. "Come on now. It's only for a few months until we get back on our feet." Cassie explained everything. She explained what she wanted, I answered. She never had the authority to make that promise. Sherry stepped forward, clearly losing patience. "We're family. I don't understand why you're making this so difficult." I looked directly at her. "Respectfully, you and I have shared dinner a few times over several years. That doesn't give anyone the right to move into my home." Kevin's expression hardened. "Seriously? You're going to turn away family after we drove 4 hours?" "I'm telling you the truth, before you unload a single box," I said calmly. "You were never invited, and you will not be staying here." For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the breeze moving through the oak trees behind the house. Then Kevin tried a different approach. "Look, Walter, we'll help around the farm. I'll fix the barn roof, maintain the property, whatever needs doing. We're not asking for charity." "The barn doesn't need fixing by someone who doesn't own it," I replied. "And this conversation isn't about work. It's about permission." Sherry shook her head in disbelief. "Cassie told us you were stubborn, but this is unbelievable." "Maybe," I answered, "but being stubborn is exactly how I spent 41 years protecting everything I earned." Kevin took another step closer. His voice became noticeably sharper. "You're really willing to destroy family relationships over whose name happens to be on a deed?" I held his gaze without raising my own voice. "It's not whose name happens to be on a deed. It's my home. I worked my entire life for it. No one gets to move into it because someone else volunteered my property without asking me." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and looked at the screen before glaring back at me. "Cassie's going to hear about this." "She already has," I replied. "Earlier this week, my attorney sent her certified notice explaining exactly where I stand. If you have legal questions, Her contact information is included in that letter. The confidence disappeared from Kevin's face almost instantly. He looked toward Sherry, then back at the truck, before stepping several yards away to make a phone call. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. At first, his voice remained calm, then it grew louder. A few moments later, it turned into obvious frustration. Whatever Cassie had promised them was collapsing in real time. Nearly 10 minutes passed before Kevin returned. He didn't argue anymore. Without another word, he climbed into the driver's seat. Sherry slammed the passenger door so hard, the sound echoed across the field. The pickup backed carefully around the garden before stopping briefly at the end of the driveway. Kevin looked at me one last time through the windshield, perhaps expecting me to change my mind. I simply stood there with my hands at my sides. A boundary only works if it never moves. Seconds later, the truck disappeared down the gravel road. I waited until it vanished beyond the trees before walking back inside. The first thing I did was review the security footage from both cameras. Every conversation had been recorded from beginning to end. I saved duplicate copies, emailed them to myself with automatic timestamps, and forwarded everything to Patricia Marsh. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. It was Cassie. I watched her name appear on the screen, then quietly placed the phone back on the kitchen table and let it ring until voicemail answered. Whatever came next, I wanted every single word preserved as evidence rather than remembered as an argument. Cassie left a voicemail that lasted nearly 7 minutes. I listened to it only once before saving multiple copies. Every accusation, every insult, every threat became another piece of evidence instead of another argument. She claimed I was selfish. She said I had embarrassed her family, humiliated Kevin and Sherry, and permanently damaged my relationship with Nathan. Then her tone shifted. She insisted she had documents proving I somehow owed her family money and warned that I would regret refusing to cooperate. I didn't respond. Patricia had been absolutely clear: never argue when someone is creating evidence against themselves. I transcribed the voicemail, added it to the growing folder that already contained camera footage, certified mail receipts, text messages, and Dennis Whitfield's investigation. Over the next 3 weeks, the farm returned to its familiar rhythm, at least on the surface. Every morning I worked in the garden, repaired fencing along the creek, and read on the back porch while pretending my mind wasn't occupied with what still needed to be done. The legal situation was under control, but my greatest concern had never been Kevin or Sherry. It was Nathan. I kept replaying our conversations over the previous months. He hadn't sounded dishonest. He had sounded exhausted. There is a difference. During my career, I had watched talented engineers slowly lose confidence after months of being told they were overreacting, imagining problems, or making situations more complicated than they really were. Eventually, they stopped trusting their own judgment and waited for someone else to tell them what was true. Looking back, I realized Nathan had begun doing exactly that. He questioned himself before he questioned anyone else. That wasn't the son Carol and I had raised. One Sunday morning, I finally called him. He answered on the second ring. His voice was polite, but the energy I remembered from years earlier was almost gone. After a few minutes of small talk, I asked a simple question. "Is Cassie home?" "She's at the grocery store," he answered. "Why?" I took a slow breath before speaking. "Nathan, I need you to come down to the farm this week. Just you. There's something important I need to show you, and I don't want anyone else in the room when you see it." He was quiet for several seconds. "Is this about Kevin and Sherry?" "It's about much more than that," I replied. He agreed to come Wednesday evening. When his truck finally pulled into the driveway, I could immediately see how much worse things had become. He looked thinner than he had only a few weeks earlier. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and the confidence that once defined him had been replaced by constant tension. We didn't begin with difficult conversations. I warmed up leftover pot roast, sliced fresh bread I had baked that morning, and poured 2 cups of coffee. We ate quietly at the kitchen table before I carried a thick folder from my office and placed it between us. Nathan looked at it, then back at me. "What's all this?" he asked. "Evidence," I answered. "And before you open it, I need one promise. For the next 30 minutes, don't hear this through Cassie's voice. Don't hear it through mine either. Just read what's actually on the pages." He nodded slowly. I opened the folder and walked him through everything, one document at a time. Dennis Whitfield's reports, Kevin's unpaid judgment, Sherry's bankruptcy, the timeline showing Cassie had resigned from her job months earlier without telling him. The financial records documenting approximately $38,000 transferred from their savings to Kevin. The denied financing application using Nathan's income information. Finally, I placed the page describing the consultation with the Nashville property attorney directly in front of him. He read every line carefully. Then he stopped. His eyes returned to the section showing the $38,000. He read it again, this time much slower. "That can't be right," he whispered. "Cassie told me those transfers were investments. Kevin was starting another business." I gently slid the supporting documentation across the table. Dennis verified the court records. Kevin's previous businesses all failed. There isn't any evidence of a successful company receiving those funds. Nathan swallowed hard. His hands began trembling slightly as he continued reading. A few minutes later, he reached the page confirming Cassie had secretly left her marketing job. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity before finally looking up at me. "She told me she was still working from home." I didn't answer immediately. Some truths don't need explanation once the evidence is sitting in front of you. He lowered his head and covered his mouth with one hand. "Dad," his voice cracked. "That was our house money. I've been working weekends, picking up extra consulting jobs, because I thought we were almost ready." The room fell completely silent except for the faint sound of the creek flowing beyond the kitchen window. I watched my son realize, piece by piece, that the future he believed he was building had quietly been dismantled behind his back. Finally, he stood, walked to the back door, and stepped onto the porch without saying another word. I let him go. Some battles cannot be fought for another person. They can only be faced beside them. After several minutes, I carried 2 fresh cups of coffee outside and placed one beside him. We stood together, looking across the dark field, where the first stars had begun appearing above the ridge. Without turning toward me, Nathan finally spoke. "If you hadn't refused to let Kevin move in, none of this would have ever come out." I nodded once. "That's exactly what I've been thinking." He closed his eyes for a moment before whispering the words that hurt more than anything else I had read inside that folder. "I've been living inside a lie, and I didn't even know it." Nathan stayed at the farm for 3 days, but we spent surprisingly little time talking about Cassie. The evidence had already said everything that needed to be said. What my son needed now wasn't another lecture. He needed solid ground beneath his feet again. The next morning, we walked down to the creek with post-hole diggers, fresh fence posts, and rolls of wire. The south fence line had shifted after a heavy spring rain, and fixing it gave our hands something useful to do while our minds slowly caught up with reality. We worked side by side for hours, measuring each section carefully, setting every post straight, packing gravel around the bases, just as I had taught him years earlier. Sometimes we talked about engineering projects. Sometimes we talked about Carol and the little habits she used to laugh about whenever the two of us became too focused on getting every measurement perfect. Other times we worked in complete silence, and somehow those quiet hours accomplished more than endless conversations ever could. Each evening we cooked together in the farmhouse kitchen. I showed him how to make the pot roast Carol had perfected decades earlier, and we laughed when my homemade peach cobbler still refused to look presentable despite tasting better than the last attempt. Little by little, I saw something returning to Nathan's face that had been missing for months. It wasn't happiness yet, it was clarity. On his final evening, we carried our coffee onto the back porch just as the deer emerged from the tree line and the valley settled into its familiar evening calm. Nathan watched them for several minutes before finally speaking. "I think I've been afraid to admit what was happening because admitting it meant I had to change my entire life." I nodded slowly. "That's a fear a lot of good people have. They stay because starting over feels more frightening than staying miserable." He stared across the field. "What do I do now?" It was the question every father wants to answer and knows he can't. "I can't decide your marriage for you," I said quietly. "But I can tell you one thing. Whatever decision you make after you've seen the truth, you'll never have to face it alone." He looked at me for a long moment before simply saying, "Thank you." When Nathan drove back to Charlotte the following morning, I stood on the porch until his truck disappeared beyond the cedar trees. I knew the hardest conversations of his life were still ahead of him. Over the following weeks, he called often. At first, the conversations were short, careful, almost as though he was testing each new discovery against the evidence I had shown him. Eventually, he confronted Cassie with everything. She admitted she had left her marketing job months earlier. She admitted much of the money had gone to Kevin, though she insisted she had intended to pay it back someday. She denied misleading him about several other financial decisions, even when documentation clearly contradicted her explanations. Every answer seemed to produce two more questions. They began marriage counseling in an honest attempt to save what remained. Nathan later told me that, during one private session, the counselor quietly explained that the pattern of manipulation, financial secrecy, emotional pressure, and constant shifting of blame wasn't simply marital conflict. It had a recognizable name. Hearing those words from an independent professional changed something inside him. For the first time, he stopped wondering whether he was overreacting and started trusting his own judgment again. By February, Cassie filed for divorce. Her attorney initially attempted to revive the idea of asserting an interest in my farm by suggesting financial contributions had somehow created future rights. Patricia Marsh responded with a detailed legal package containing the property deed, certified notices, investigation timeline, documented communications, and Tennessee statutes that left virtually no room for interpretation. 2 weeks later, the attorney quietly withdrew that argument and never raised it again. The law had done exactly what it was supposed to do because every fact had been documented before emotions had a chance to rewrite the story. Cassie eventually moved out, and Kevin and Sherry helped her settle into a small rental outside Charlotte. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing joyful about watching a family fall apart, even when the outcome was necessary. What I did notice over the next several months was something far more meaningful. Nathan's voice gradually changed. The hesitation disappeared. The constant second-guessing faded. He laughed more often. He started talking excitedly about engineering projects again instead of household problems. In early summer, he called to tell me he had accepted a position with an engineering firm in Knoxville, only a short drive from the farm. "I think it's time for a fresh start," he said. "Not because I'm running away, because I'm finally running towards something." A few weeks after moving, he drove down for dinner carrying a bottle of good wine and introduced me to someone named Dana, a structural engineer from his new office who had grown up on a family farm in Western Virginia. Before she even stepped inside the house, she slowly walked the property, studying the restored barn, the stonework along the creek, and the covered porch I had built with my own hands. Smiling, she looked at me and said, "These foundation footings are professionally done." I laughed. 41 years as a civil engineer leaves behind a few habits. She smiled back. "It certainly does." I glanced toward Nathan. For the first time in longer than I could remember, he wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's choices. He simply looked peaceful, and that alone told me we had finally begun leaving the hardest chapter behind us. The divorce became official in November. Nathan called me from the parking lot outside his attorney's office before he even started the truck. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he let out a slow breath that sounded lighter than any words he could have chosen. "It's over, Dad." I smiled quietly as I looked across the field where frost covered the grass beneath the morning sun. "How do you feel?" I asked. He thought about it before answering. "Relieved. Mostly relieved. I keep wondering why it took me so long to see what was happening." I rested my coffee cup against the porch railing. "Don't spend too much time punishing yourself for trusting someone you loved. Trust wasn't your mistake. Betraying it was hers." He was silent for several moments before saying softly, "You never once told me. I told you so." "Why?" I looked toward the creek where the water flowed with the same steady confidence it had since the day I bought the farm. "Because winning an argument was never my goal. Getting my son back was." He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something I hadn't heard in a very long time. "Peace. Thanks for never giving up on me." The following spring, Nathan invited me to dinner at the farmhouse. Dana was already there, helping prepare vegetables from the garden, while laughing about whose recipe deserved credit for the evening's meal. Watching the two of them together reminded me of something Carol once told me many years ago. The right relationship doesn't make life smaller. It gives you more room to become yourself. After dinner, Nathan asked Dana to walk with him onto the back porch overlooking the valley. I stayed inside long enough to give them privacy, pretending to wash dishes while smiling to myself, because fathers usually know these moments before anyone says a word. A few minutes later, I heard laughter, followed by quiet tears of happiness. When I stepped outside, Dana was wearing a ring and Nathan looked 10 years younger than he had the previous autumn. "She said yes," he announced, unable to stop smiling. I hugged them both, and for just a moment, I imagined Carol standing beside us, proud of the man our son had become, despite everything he had endured. They were married that September at a small vineyard in the Sequatchie Valley, surrounded by close friends, family, and colleagues from their engineering firm. The ceremony was simple, honest, and free from unnecessary extravagance. When it came time for my toast, I looked at Nathan before raising my glass. Strong structures don't survive because they never face storms. They survive because they're built on solid foundations. The same is true of families, marriages, and character. May you spend the rest of your lives protecting the foundation you've chosen to build together. Dana's mother wiped away tears. Nathan laughed and shook his head, telling everyone afterward that I had somehow managed to turn engineering into marriage advice. For the first time in years, every laugh around the table felt completely genuine. Almost a year later, on a crisp November morning, I was sitting on the same back porch with a cup of coffee and a history book resting unopened in my lap when I heard two vehicles pulling up the gravel driveway. Nathan climbed out first, followed by Dana, who carefully carried a white envelope pressed gently against her jacket. They walked toward me without saying a word. Dana handed me the envelope. Inside was a grainy ultrasound photograph. I stared at the tiny image longer than I realized before looking back at both of them. Nathan smiled exactly the way he had as a little boy, whenever he couldn't wait to share good news. "We wanted you to be the first to know." My eyes drifted across the property that had once been nothing more than an abandoned farmhouse, surrounded by weeds and broken fences. I had bought this land, believing I was investing in solitude after a lifetime of hard work. Instead, I had built something far greater. By refusing to surrender what was rightfully mine, I hadn't simply protected a piece of property. I had protected my son's future, preserved the values Carol and I had spent decades teaching him, and created a place where another generation would someday run across these same fields, beside this same creek. The people who tried to take shortcuts were gone, still searching for someone else to rescue them. Meanwhile, everything worth keeping had remained exactly where honesty, patience, and hard work had placed it. I raised my coffee cup toward Nathan. He smiled and lifted his own. In that quiet Tennessee morning, surrounded by family instead of conflict, I finally understood the lesson this farm had been teaching me from the very beginning. Sometimes the most important thing you'll ever defend isn't land, money, or a house. It's the integrity that allows the people you love to build a better life after you're gone. And if protecting that integrity requires standing alone for a while, then stand anyway. One day, someone you love may look back and realize your courage became the foundation that allowed them to find their own. Looking across the valley as the frost slowly disappeared beneath the rising sun, I knew with absolute certainty that every difficult decision, every legal document, every sleepless night, and every painful conversation had been worth it. Peace, I finally learned, isn't something you're given, it's something you earn by refusing to surrender what truly matters.